see what you have to say. Okay,
Thank
so
you.
the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It is an enormous privilege to be here. Coming to Sweden, which I've only done once before, is a wonderful thing to do for anybody who tried to play, however humble a role, in the struggle against apartheid, because let's remember Swedish institutions, including the Nordic Africa Institutet, and the role played by some of you in that struggle. So it's a great honor to be invited to come here, the home of some friends, unfortunately some of them late friends, during a period of exile. And it's 50 years, apparently, which I didn't know until I read the poster, so that too makes it quite special. Now, I think of cities not in the same way as Rem Koolhaas, but I think of cities as essentially sites of chaos. And I don't therefore think that attempting to bring an order to our thinking is ever going to be, at least for me, I'm not commenting on any of you, but at least for me, that won't be a satisfactory thing to do. I have heard a variety of ways of trying to grapple this morning, as we always do, and we will continue to do, with these very, very complicated things. This object with 4 letters in English and 1 or 2 other languages, city. We are all grappling for different instruments that in our own way will give us some handle on this phenomenon, on this thing, on this object of study, on this object of intervention. And in my case, the object of intervention, the city, is being approached because I am, as Andrew said, part of this project. It's not called global suburbs, actually, it's called global suburbanisms. The instrument, the idea, the word, the set of concepts, whatever it actually is, that I'm attempting to use along with a team of other people around the world, about half of them in Canada because it is a Canadian-funded project, this thing is called global suburbanisms, and the idea of suburbanism, I suppose, captures the sort of instrument that we're trying to use to grapple with this very complicated, if not entirely chaotic, phenomenon of the city. In sum, the subject that I'm addressing is really social change in African cities, and the instrument that we are perhaps using to look at social change in African cities is this word suburbanism. African cities are not necessarily getting worse. There are a lot of people in the world who have an investment in conditions getting worse because it increases their opportunities for the scourge of consultancy in various directions and other such things. I personally do not have an investment in things getting worse. I have a very substantial investment in my head in things getting better. And although economic growth and change doesn't always bring things that are better for everybody, and certainly not equally, there's plenty of evidence around the world, including in Africa, that things are changing, and sometimes for large numbers of people. Dr. Casey referred to this a few moments ago. Actually, not getting worse. A very interesting phenomenon on the African continent. What does that mean in terms of our workshop theme of inclusion and exclusion? I don't know the answers to those questions, but these are the things that we're trying to grapple with by way of some perhaps fairly crude forms of thinking at the moment about suburbanisms. Now, suburbanisms therefore means a lot of things. It means life in a variety of places across different social classes. I'm not going to read out all these words, they're pretty straightforward. It means a lot of different things. It means a lot of different spaces. It means different paces of change in social class formation, to use an old kind of phrase. It means many, many different things. So although I accepted the title that begins with peripheries, our work is not completely confined to the idea of peripheries. It's not confined to what is perhaps usually implied in a variety of languages when one grapples for words like suburb or suburbanism. I don't know what you say in Swedish for these phenomena, for these concepts, but I certainly know that in Portuguese, suburbio does not necessarily mean the same as it does when an English speaker in different English-speaking parts of the world uses the word suburb or suburbanism. It probably means something about something peripheral. And as with words like banlieue and faubourg in French, it probably has a somewhat derogatory component attached to it when it is articulated in the mouths of bourgeois and middle class and powerful people. In South Africa, a country which, as you know, like all countries in Africa, has many languages, some of which are official versions of the same, there are different terms for describing these phenomena. For example, in isiZulu, possibly the best known South African language by name outside the country, ipetelo ledoloba is a phrase that you might hear people use. And if I had to translate that into English on the basis of my extremely weak knowledge of the Zulu language, I would say we are talking about peripheries. We are talking about the outskirts of the city. We are talking about frontiers even of the city that you would come to when you approach the city from outside. Because let's remember, most people in Africa do not approach the edge of the city from inside. They approach from the outside, which is different from Paris and London and New York. Okay, so that's a background. And what I wish to do is to talk a little bit about some of the changes which are implied in a slide of this kind. In our work so far, which is based more or less entirely on reviewing literatures, a difficult task, most literatures on African cities implied by something Vanessa said at the beginning of her talk this morning. Most literatures on African cities that are printed and accessible in libraries such as the excellent library of the Nordica Africa Institute, which I hope to visit if I have 5 minutes, which has a much larger collection of material on Africa than just about any library in Africa, with 2 or 3 exceptions. Most of these literatures that accumulate in a place such as that, of course, are produced outside the African continent. I've recently experienced this particularly sharply because I was asked by some colleagues seated over here at the edge of the hall to review literatures in French on African cities produced in Africa. Well, I'll just leave it at that, and you can go and have a look and see what you find. So, in reviewing these literatures, what have we found? Well, we found perhaps there's a reasonable degree of agreement or consensus around these 3 points. Of course, there is a moving edge, the front d'urbanisation, the frontier, this thing which is somewhat difficult to map and which is traveling away from other places. Perhaps that's the sense that's implied. And it's a moving edge in relation to all kinds of different pressures. And those pressures are things that we're trying to get at through thinking about what we might mean by suburbanisms on the African continent. We also find that there is an enormous amount of discussion going on about what spatially oriented people would call densifications, what other people might call retrofitting, or other terms would be used, of what we might loosely call existing suburbs. And there are many kinds of existing suburbs. If I leave myself enough time, I'll show you some pictures if it all works here. And the city, for example, that Dr. Kesi comes from has an old suburb called Kariakoo, situated outside, segregated outside some of the other older parts of the city of Dar es Salaam. And if you want an example in Africa of the retrofitting or densification of an old suburb, somewhere in Africa, I invite you, as many of you will have done, to visit Carriacou, which has radically transformed, even since I first started to go to Dar es Salaam at the invitation of Dr. Casey and his colleagues some years ago. So there's a massive amount of change in very different kinds of areas with different origins, including public housing origins and other such phenomena. And of course, the third point, everybody now talks about new centralities. And again, if you come from a spatially based discipline such as geography and sometimes urban planning, you will probably think about that question in spatial form. But it has many other meanings associated with it as well. A very well-known Swedish scholar, Göran Therborn, founder of another institute just up the road here, would probably start by thinking about power and centralities of power, and maybe get to the geographies of power later on. So we're not only talking about space in some simple sense. Now what I want to do is try and show you some pictures. Oops, Carol, I'll have to wipe that out, so to speak. That's embarrassing. Let's see if I can give you a slideshow. I think I probably can. Let's start here. Yes, look at this. Fabulous, I don't want that. Okay, so let me just, in a scattered way, not in a highly organized way, in a rather post-colonial, post-modern, post-something or other. 3 pictures of Luanda. Luanda, one of the fastest growing cities in Africa. Boa Vista, Bom Vista, which you might think of as the periphery, suburbio of Luanda, and another form of suburb in Luanda. So that's a very quick way of indicating the diversity of the spaces and possibly the forms of life and the suburbanisms of which we speak. So let's pass through various long-established cities which have different centralities in West African countries, in landlocked West African countries, as well as coastal West African countries. This is Niamey in Niger. And let us remark that the meaning of banlieue, for example, in places such as that, will vary a great deal. I do wish I could make this thing stop showing. Perhaps I can. I'll see. Dar es Salaam, again, with obviously various forms of growth. So here a concentration on the moving frontier, mapping some of what Carol was talking about to the extent possible. The periphery of Maputo. Is this, something that illustrates this apparent interpenetration of formal, informal, and customary? Other African cities have very different peripheries. Admittedly, this is north of the Sahara. It's Tunis. And looking across the expanse of the city, looking at the kind of new expansion on the periphery that's taking place. So let us bear in mind it doesn't all look like Bom Vista, the suburbios of Luanda. And as you see, this really is the edge of Tunis. Don't think it's all formal, folks. Don't think you can show who owns the piece of land. Let's move to Dhaka, symbolized by something common to everybody who's been to Dhaka. And let us think that Dhaka is a place that relates, of course, different communes, a concentration of population in communes such as Pikine, but it also relates to the Dakar urban region, if we may call it that. Sorry, this is sideways, but Dakar relates over 100 kilometers to Touba. And everything between Dakar and Touba could be described in some respects as suburban. And here is the name Touba, but my goodness, the sign is in English, not in Wolof or in French. Why? Because this shop called Touba is in another suburb of Touba called Port Elizabeth, Nelson Mandela City in South Africa. And that's telling you something about connections between the places that are growing fast in the peripheries of African cities around the world. That's just to remind you we are here in Nelson Mandela City. Well, I will, of course, so really the point that I'm making is The peripheries and other parts of the cities, as here in Nairobi, are strongly connected to one another. The same is obviously true in every West African city, every Southern African city, every Central African city. Those peripheries may become central, as Tuba has, not really a suburb, I suppose you would say, of Dhaka, in all sorts of ways. Go to Accra, a British colonized country once, Swedish slave trading on the coast, it's true, long ago, goodness me. And if we travel out, if we begin in the so-called center of Dhaka and travel out, we will pass through extraordinarily mixed environments. And the emphasis that I would wish you to have here is on the activities, the huge diversity of activities, the different forms of life, the different forms of social relationships which are growing up, perhaps concealed in part behind the physical expansion, often along major routes connecting the coast or the interior of Ghana. And against that backdrop, of course, we also see massively increasing foreign investments in African cities. Here indicating, that last picture indicating some of the places at which a group that's quite close to this candidate for the French presidential election called Nicolas Sarkozy, one of his buddies, controls a large group which has been massively increasing its investments in African cities, along with people from other continents, as illustrated in an interesting book from your institute, China and India. And if we go again to the north, we can see, this is in Tunis, the common vision of the result of that increasing foreign investment in industrial terms, in transport terms, in financial terms, in new urban space terms as well. As indicated here in Tunis, somewhat arrested because here the investment is actually from Qatar and Abu Dhabi, a little reduced over recent years, but nonetheless. And of course, if we go to Tunis, that'll remind us of some other events that have taken place in Northern Africa. I'm not going to elaborate on those, but there is clearly a relationship between some of those events and these other external relationships. So these new commercial zones, here's one called The Zone, very close to where I live in Johannesburg, but which is not very different from the layout of a shopping mall such as in Accra. This is the Accra Mall in Accra. Built, by the way, on land, Carol, this would suit your purposes, which is not really owned by the people who've built that shopping mall, but certainly they have the power to defend that land against other takers. Some forms of work in the commercial environment, sometimes the industrial environment, the so-called logistics environment, of course, in such spaces. And as I said, transformation of other older spaces. Public housing here seen in Dar es Salaam along Morogoro Road. Here seen in the fabulous modernism of the South African township exported to Lubumbashi and various other parts of Southern Africa, with enormous amounts of transformation going on. So here is a scene in Soweto, and if you look closely into this kind of scene, you'll observe right away that very few of the original housing units remain in exactly the way that they once were. And one can transfer from that environment to many other public and semi-public housing environments in other parts of Africa. Here again in Dar es Salaam, this is my favorite East German-inspired public housing in Dar es Salaam. But if you actually go and look at the transformations of environments like that from Casablanca to Cape Town, you will find enormous amounts of social as well as other kinds of change, and the economic activities pointed to by others today being carried out, of course. Plus new areas, sometimes walled off, being built by new developers at different heights, different intensities, sometimes mixed up with all sorts of other circumstances, sometimes a mix not just of spaces but of lives and lifestyles. I'll skip from Dhaka and go back to Accra very briefly. So I enjoy this slide because it captures this mix of religion and selling used tires, which I think is fairly typical of some of the economic activities which we would find. And if we went to Kinshasa, perhaps we would find an accelerating development in these kinds of directions, now quite well described in a growing literature, both from Quinoa themselves, as well as from some very interesting outsiders, such as Bill Freund, working in a project ultimately funded by the same people who funded Carol's project, actually. Okay, so back to carrying out our circumstances. What kinds of changes? What are we relating to here? What forms of transport? What forms of individualism? What forms of private property, if such a thing can be said to exist? What vision of the future? The person who has put up this building clearly has a vision of a future, as you can see on the roof. What aspirations? And ultimately, perhaps our attempt to approach these matters at present is proving to be rather concentrated on the physical changes. That's certainly what I will have drawn your attention to as we've passed through some of these pictures. Here we are again in Dar es Salaam. Okay. So let me move, here's Kariakoo. I promised I'd show you one or two pictures. Here is Kariakoo, densification of what the foreground looked like some years ago, 10, 20 years ago. Question is, what is the future of neighborhoods like this? Not just what is the physical future of neighborhoods like this, here back, courtesy of Paul Jenkins, on the periphery of Maputo. What is the future of neighborhoods like this? What is the future of their social diversity? What is the future of the relationships between people in places such as this and rural areas? One way of thinking about it is to go the sort of Michel Agier route and think about the city of refugees as the figure of the future in African circumstances. So let me conclude by saying, ultimately, yes, we aren't just interested in how we got here. We're also interested in the image of the future of the African city, not necessarily in that advertisement from a well-known South African parastatal for Timbuktu 2048, which you saw on the screen a moment ago. What are we really trying to do here? We're taking advantage, and I think that's what many of us have to do. We're taking advantage of a global project funded by the research agency of a wealthy country. In our case, it happens to be Canada, which allows us to begin to bend and adapt a variety of words, of social concepts, which may or may not be applicable in complex ways, which may or may not be useful in directed ways around the world, south, north, whichever other divisions we wish to suggest. But what we are searching for is new kinds of ways to reconstruct, to reinvent our understandings of cities across the continent of Africa. Why? Partly because we are, I suppose, interested in their future. Partly because I suppose we would like African cities to be accorded more respect. Partly because we'd like them to be accorded more respect, not only by an international scholarly community, but by their citizens themselves. And in order to accomplish that outcome, we would need to be able to help, at least in a small way, some of the people who continue to live in African cities, and their friends, relatives, colleagues, supporters, and dependents in other parts of the world, to contemplate radical changes which are taking place in the forms of life, with which perhaps our familiarity has turned into something which blinds us to the scale, the intensity, and the pace, and of course the direction of changes taking place in our midst. These points will lead to substantial debate. These points will, over time, as our case studies proceed and as research that's represented in this room and elsewhere proceeds, these points will become increasingly controversial. Consensus around how we think African cities will become harder and harder to find. I would suggest that Amin's presentation today already gives us an indication of how painful, difficult, and potentially controversial questions are increasingly going to be opened up. And if there's one result that we already have from our cases haltingly proceeding in Durban, in Accra, not yet really underway in Dar es Salaam, and in one or two other parts of the African continent, suggest the depth of disagreement, the depth of confrontation, the depth of different ways of thinking and different ways of doing, of different ways of thinking, for example, about the state and its relationship to its own law, the point which Amin was referring to as I understood it earlier on. As we explore suburbanisms in Africa, we find that we're pulling away a whole lot of layers of cover, and some very intriguing, sometimes very positive, sometimes very disturbing features of life in African cities are beginning to emerge in new forms. And if I have succeeded in drawing those points to some of your attention, I have done what I came at your invitation to do. Thank you very much.